Welcome, welcome everyone to Hackers on Planet Earth, the pandemic edition. I'm introducing today's 2 o'clock keynote, and I'm so excited to do so. I'm introducing Yeshimabeit Milner, who's the founder and executive director of Data for Black Lives. She really has such an interesting profile. And in fact, the Financial Times wrote this fantastic piece about her recently, and I recommend that you go look it up. And one of the things about that profile is that it features a very hackish story. When she was in high school, she got suspended, like maybe many of us. And then what she did next was so interesting. She decided to collect data about who was getting suspended. And lo and behold, she found that Black children like her, and this is a quote from the Financial Times, were 4 times more likely to be suspended than white children. This was the beginning of her life as a data activist. And indeed, that's where she built her kind of lifelong commitment to movement building and data activism. She has married the two together in this phenomenal organization. I think you should definitely look up Data for Black Lives. There's so much more I can say about her and what she's done and what she's accomplished, but I think you're here to listen to her and not me. So please join me in a virtual welcome. And I turn it over to Yeshimabeit Milner for today's Hope keynote.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman, and thank you to everyone who's been a part of the process of organizing this conference. I'm so honored to be a part of the Hope Conference this year. Sadly, I can't be with you all in person, but I'm really, really glad to be able to share more about the work we're doing at Data for Black Lives. Data for Black Lives is a movement of over 4,000 scientists and activists committed to harnessing the power of data and technology to make concrete and measurable change in the lives of Black people. Data for Black Lives began with a vision, my vision, a bold, ambitious, but very possible vision of changing the role that data plays in public life, in the lives of historically oppressed people, and in particular, in the lives of Black people. We launched the organization officially with a conference at the MIT Media Lab in November of 2017, and 3 years in, this vision has grown into a powerful force of scientists and activists equipped with the skills, empathy, and the ability to create a new blueprint for the future. And we are continuing to grow. This year, we will be responding to the urgency of the political moment, but also the request of people all over the US and globe to bring the Data for Black Lives mission where they live. The mission to make data a tool for social change instead of a weapon of political oppression. This talk is entitled Abolish Big Data. It's the name of the talk that I've been giving for the past year and a half. It's also the name of my forthcoming book. And it's so exciting to see in this moment the word abolition, and abolition as a political and necessary process has emerged to the mainstream. Abolition by definition means to recognize that reform is not enough. And abolish big data is a call to action that recognizes that the bullets, police dogs, and fire hoses of the past have become the predictive policing algorithms, voter suppression apparatuses, and facial recognition systems of the present. Algorithms and other big data technologies are the engines facilitating the evolution of chattel slavery into the prison industrial complex and have created the conditions for the crisis that we face now. The prison abolition movement asked the question, how do we create solutions in our communities without recourse to prisons? In this talk, I apply the same lens to big data. How can we reimagine the structures and industries that concentrate big data into the hands of a few? And how can we abolish the structures that turn data into a powerful and deadly weapon? This is not a call to end the use of all data, quite the opposite. The call to abolish prisons and to abolish the police is not a call to abolish accountability, but to get rid of, for once and for all, a punitive, violent system that simply is not working for society. The call to abolish big data is to dismantle the oppressive structures and industries that surround its use. Big data is more than a collection of technologies, a vast amount of information and different types of it. It is more than a revolution in measurement and prediction. It has become a philosophy, an ideological regime about how decisions are made and who makes them. It has given legitimacy to a new form of social and political control that has taken the digital artifacts of our existence and found new ways to use them against us. And big data is not new, it is not novel or as revolutionary as we often worship it to be, but it is a part of a long and pervasive historical legacy and technological timeline of scientific oppression, aggressive public policy, and the most influential political and economic system that continues to shape this country's economy, chattel slavery. I believe that what we face today and what we must name is a data industrial complex, where zip code is destiny, where debt becomes a ball and chain weaponized by complex and obscure financial systems, where data is a strategy to rob people of political power by manipulating elections, a system and culture where persistent, archaic, and racist notions of risk persist, narratives more powerful and impenetrable than any prison cell that could ever be built. Data for Black Lives was founded on the belief that we have the opportunity with data to abolish, reimagine, and create new structures of knowledge production, new forms of decision-making, and that the ways in which we are able to create new forms of relating to each other, the possibilities are infinite. Because of the enormity of the threat that is scary and unprecedented, this discourse has been very negative and fatalistic. This does not reflect the agency of our communities and our movements. We don't want people to give up and get overwhelmed. We want to create alternatives. I first learned to collect, analyze, and use data as a high school student because early on I realized that alone we could be ignored, but that there was power in a number. This video shows something that happened at a neighboring high school, the school that I was supposed to be a part of according to my address, that my sister went to, my friends from elementary school went to. Students had organized a peaceful protest in response to a school administrator putting a ninth grader in a headlock. It made national news, but not in the way that it would today. I will never forget seeing footage of SWAT team units flood the school, of police shoving the small frames of students I grew up with against police cars. On CNN and local news, there were headlines read, "Riot at Miami Edison Senior High." I knew that unless we found new ways to be heard, to disrupt narratives that facilitated this level of abuse, my future and the futures of many other people, young people, would be at stake. When we were turned away from public hearings at the school board and totally dismissed by then Superintendent Rudy Crew, we hit the ground running and surveyed 600 students about their experiences with suspensions and arrests in schools. For many of these young people surveyed, that was their first time ever being asked about their experiences in schools. And at that moment, they had realized they weren't bad kids because they'd been suspended for forgetting their school ID or wearing the wrong color t-shirt with their uniform, but that this was a statewide problem and a national problem, and it was known as the school to prison pipeline. Later on, after graduating from college, I returned to Miami with a renewed sense of purpose and an arsenal and skills in data collection and research that was urgently needed. I was asked to lead a reproductive justice campaign to address the Black infant mortality crisis. And although nationally, the infant mortality rate had decreased steadily over the past 50 years, the Black infant mortality rate had remained constant. Black babies were 3 times more likely to die before their first birthday than white babies. Mothers in the community knew that this tragedy was connected to hospital policies and practices such as the aggressive marketing of infant formula, and the unnecessary use of procedures that were costly and dangerous, like C-section, cesarean section. But without data, community outcry was ignored. With a small team of moms, I surveyed 300 mothers on their experiences giving birth in Miami, in particular at Jackson Memorial Hospital, our public hospital, and the largest hospital in the country. We weren't able to bring 300 mothers into the boardroom with us when we finally had a meeting with the hospital, but the CEO and the rest of the staff could not deny the data that we collected. A campaign that had taken up to that point years to even push through took only a few months to win. And today the lives of hundreds of mothers and babies have been impacted by the policies that we fought for. And that same summer, while I was working on this campaign and still continuing the fight for restorative justice, Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman, was acquitted based on stand your ground laws. When we found out the news in Miami, a group of us young people led by the group Dream Defenders drove up to Tallahassee, Florida, the capital, and occupied the state capitol. We spent over a month sleeping on the floor, the cold marble floor of the state capitol, not because we wanted to make a blanket political statement, but because it had become legal, effectively, in the state of Florida to kill a Black child with impunity, according to stand your ground laws, which was a codification of perceived threat. In all of these experiences, whether it was in the hospitals, whether it was my original experience in school, whether it was us literally camping out in the state capitol for 30 days, I knew that what we were fighting against were not just the institutions whose policies and practices sought to undermine our lives, but behind those policies and practices, the narratives that justified, endorsed, and encouraged these civil rights and human rights abuses. Narratives grounded in data that must also be abolished while we do the work of dismantling the structures that perpetuated them. And perhaps the most harmful narrative surrounds the notion of risk. The very first time I even heard the word at risk was actually in the 4th grade. It was coincidentally in a computer class. I also got suspended in 6th grade in a computer class. I think that was a sign that maybe I was on the right track in terms of some of the work I was doing. I always believe that you face opposition when you're on the right track. Friction, right? That's a law of physics. But anyway, I was talking to another student and she was telling me that she was at risk, that we were all at risk. I'm 9 years old and I'm afraid. I'm like, what's going on? Why are you at risk? And she said, she's a part of an after school program. While she really liked the program, that it was for at-risk students. Children who are at risk of going to prison, of having an unwanted pregnancy at an early age, of even dying early. Again, she liked that program, but it was almost like being a part of it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was as if these programs and this language foreshadowed the narrow options for not just what we could do after school every day, but also who we would become. And for me, as someone who I always say survived the school to prison pipeline, again, in a lot of ways, that term has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So how did the word risk, which finds its origins in finance and business, insurance, loss prevention, and become a label, operationalized through policy and weaponized against young people like me and my friend? This is one of my favorite examples here of machine learning, and probably one of the most useful, I would say, autocorrect, right? In this, we see the word risk and the synonyms: danger, jeopardy, peril, hazard, menace, threat. How did these terms become used against young Black people? How do they become used in order to push narratives that have then and now condoned the deaths of people like Brother George Floyd and have allowed it so that we've gone so long without any justice for Breonna Taylor? These are present, they're cultural, but they're also driven by the weaponization of data and statistics. With the end of the civil rights movement, the war on drugs, also known as the war on communities, Black communities specifically, and the introduction of massive legislation to push forward the most violent civil rights and human rights assaults of our lifetime, mass incarceration, came a wave of research and data to justify the targeted and coordinated efforts to warehouse entire communities into prisons. The term super predator was introduced by social scientist and Bush administration advisor John DiIulio in 1995. DiIulio created an entire theory around the notion that a new generation of street criminals is upon us, the youngest, biggest, and baddest generation any society has ever known. Based on what we have witnessed, researched, and heard from people who are close to the action, he wrote with two co-authors, "Here is what we believe. America is now home to thickening ranks of juvenile super predators, radically impulsive, brutally remorseless youngsters, including ever more pre-teenage boys who murder, assault, rape, rob, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, join gun-toting gangs, and create serious communal disorders. At the core," he said, "the problem is that most inner-city children grow up surrounded by teenagers who are themselves deviant, delinquent, and criminal. The point of this was to spark panic. The point of this was to fuel vitriol and hatred and take the emotions of suburban white people, other factors of society, and to harness that to power tough on crime policies and practices that proved to be 100% successful in criminalizing Black people for the next few decades. It took years eventually for DiIulio to admit what we all know to be true, right? That none of these predictions that he claimed, not only were they wrong, they were the exact opposite of what was happening in quote unquote inner city neighborhoods across the nation. But by the time he admitted it in 2001, years later, after converting to Catholicism and wanting to do the right thing, so to speak, these policies had already been in motion. They had become automated into the American imagination. In another example, John DiIulio was not alone. In the 1980s, well before Super Predator, Dr. Ira Chasnoff built an entire career off of the crack baby myth, which was based on a flimsy study comprising of only 23 participants. It was based on a hypothesis that was in lockstep with the most racist political intentions, a fear that one day a generation of children would grow up to be crack addicted and a burden to society. All of this was wrong. And as researchers, we know that the sample size, 23 participants, 23 babies, should have refuted the validity of this study alone, but it was not. And similarly, the reality was true, right? Later on, through this New York Times kind of expose that follows one of the quote unquote crack babies featured in this, who participated in this study, one of the babies, who's now a young woman today, grew up to be a healthy, functioning, and quite exceptional young woman, the first in her family to graduate from college. Poverty, rather than crack addiction, has been found to be way more harmful in the child's life. And lastly, the welfare queen myth, right? Which is used and has continued to be used right now in this moment of COVID-19 recovery, right? This has been used to dismantle our country's safety net, to privatize social services and siphon resources away from the very communities who need them and who pay for them with taxpayer dollars. Meanwhile, the real welfare queens are the corporations who benefit more from government subsidies than all of the individual food stamp, Medicaid, unemployment benefits combined, benefit recipients, combined. Especially right now, with so many people are being crushed under the weight of the absence of a safety net that their very tax dollars should have been paying for. In the age of big data, unless we are aware of this history, and this is just recent history, this is I'm 30 years old. This is all in my lifetime, right? Unless we're aware of this history, we risk repeating it. And I think that's a bit of a more appropriate term of the use of the term risk. So before we go into more modern contemporary examples again, before we talk about algorithms and machine learning and the ways in which these myths are being reinforced and perpetuated in this moment, we must first discuss the history of big data. We have to tell its origin story. What were the economic, imperialistic, and colonial contexts that required the level of record keeping, accounting, and surveillance that have come to define the big data practices of today? Contrary to popular belief, slavery was not the antithesis to business innovation. And much of what we know about scientific management science, finance, does not come from the factory floor, the railroad, or the steam engine. The big data systems we are familiar with today used to control, surveil, and enact violence, to maintain power structures, and ensure profit on a global scale originated during slavery. In the 1600s and 1700s, the Dutch East and West India companies were the largest commercial enterprises in the world, with hundreds of ships, thousands of employees, countless offices in Asia and the Americas. The VOC and WOC's operations were mirrored all over the Atlantic and brought to the US. These were the most powerful corporations in the world. In proportional terms, they were wealthier and more powerful than Apple, Google, and Facebook combined. These companies pioneered colonialism, created the blueprint for globalization, and developed new data practices required to maintain this massive operation. And although this history has been largely ignored and erased, these sophisticated big data practices predate the analytical tools we use today. Big data practices were not engineered out of creativity or innovation. This wasn't Newton sitting under a tree and an apple falling on his head, but in the deeply violent transatlantic slave trade, which trafficked over 12.5 million enslaved African people to the Americas. Dr. Caitlin Rosenthal, author of Accounting for Slavery, Masters in Management, writes that planters controlled over enslaved people made it easier for them to fit their slaves into neat empirical rows and columns. The abstraction of the catastrophic loss of life and the necessary torture required to maintain plantations was needed to serve the owners who were so far removed from the daily abuse of the literal rows and columns, rows and fields of the sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations they owned. Data moved up and down hierarchies, akin to the way in which CEOs and boards are today responsible for, but never accountable to the violence they inflict. Big data was necessary to distance oneself from the violence and the gore capitalism of slavery. The standardized reports used to account for slavery reflect the legacy of the thorough record keeping of the Dutch Empire and can be found in reports from British Guyana and later in South America. This hits home for me because British Guyana was where my family and my own ancestors were trafficked to and enslaved. So this is a monthly abstract for a plantation disturbingly named Hope and Experiment. Literally, the name of the plantation was Hope and Experiment. And it reveals the rigorously calculated operations for each month. There was one line for each day with columns for the many different categories of men, women, and children. They include in the field, watchmen, house servants, carpenters, invalids, and runaways. Children's labor was essential to the operations of the plantation, and their role was justified by the brutal logic of capitalism. And I quote one slave owner, "The hand of a Negro child is best calculated to extract the weed and grass. This daily process of dehumanization was deeply numerical, And below the monthly abstracts were identical reports for livestock. Negro account and livestock account use the same methods of taking an inventory, calculating increase and decrease, purchase, sale, birth, death, slaughter, murder, with very little difference made for woman, man, child, oxen, goat, and cattle. But the most necessary form of accounting used and operationalized, and is so similar to what's happening today, was in the wielding of information as a weapon to create fear, distrust, and to neutralize collective action amongst enslaved people. From removing verses in texts such as the Bible that rejected slavery, and using amputation, whipping, and torture to ensure that no one could even read, write, or communicate at all. Information systems developed during slavery were created with the intention of eclipsing the networks that allowed enslaved people, Black people, to assert their strength in numbers, to become educated and informed, to escape, to organize, and to fight back. All of these examples indicate the ways in which big data was born out of bondage. There's so many other examples, and you're all gonna have to wait for the book to come out and some more materials to read more about it, but there's so many examples that make this connection. And I think there's so many examples because, of course, this history has been largely repressed. We're not taught this in schools, and we certainly aren't taught this when we're learning about technology, whether at school or on our own or whatever. But this emphasizes my earlier point that big data isn't new or as innovative as we worship it to be, but it's a part of this longer historical legacy. We often say that no algorithm is neutral, that algorithms are opinions embedded into code. And this history reveals the extent to which this is true. So by definition, an algorithm is a step-by-step function, a set of instructions to solve a problem. A recipe is an algorithm. It's the instructions on how to make the dish, the ingredients that make up the dish, and the result, based on what we define from the beginning of the recipe as success. Whether we want to focus on making something healthy or something that tastes good, regardless of health benefits. These decisions are informed by a question: what are we optimizing? Computational algorithms are layered, complicated, and their ingredients are not just the raw data that is fed into them, and the result is not as simple as the outputs that come from them. Scores, ratios, GPS routes, and Netflix recommendations. But as the chart demonstrates, histories and values are what influence inputs and outputs. And most importantly, the very models that are trained and developed the algorithms themselves. One example are FICO credit scores. So contrary to popular belief, FICO is not a federal agency. It's the Fair and Isaac Company, a for-profit entity started by William Fair and Earl Isaac, and who 25 years ago wanted to disrupt risk in lending through the creation of an algorithm and through the use of machine learning. And as we're told, the inputs of the FICO algorithm are the debt we have, the percentage of missed payments, how many credit cards we have, et cetera. And this information, our data, is provided through a collusion of data brokers, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, and then fed into the FICO algorithm. And while we are told that certain behaviors and financial characteristics compromise our credit score, we aren't able to verify because FICO is a proprietary algorithm, a black box devoid of transparency with the purpose of displacing accountability away from the for-profit companies that profit from our data at will and obviously at our expense. And FICO credit scores reflect are one algorithms that reflect the tremendous power that these algorithms hold over our lives. At this very moment, there are students who will have to drop out of school because they cannot qualify for subsidized student loans. There are people struggling to afford rising public transportation costs because they cannot afford subprime car payments. And even hardworking families facing homelessness because they can't rent an apartment, all because of a 3-digit number. And this 3-digit number will increasingly decide whether we get hired for the job And even if we somebody do not resist, whether or not we have the right to assume citizenship or be deported. While it is in violation of federal law to deny people housing, employment, and education based on race, you can't sue an algorithm. And private companies like FICO, which I must also mention, is in their best interest to make sure that some people have low scores and others don't, argue that their algorithms don't discriminate. They say nowhere in their algorithm or in their inputs is race a variable. But we know that based on the history of this country, how our neighborhoods and municipalities are organized, you don't need race as a variable. When redlining, the legacy of slavery, have made zip codes proxies for race. Only several generations after slavery, 6 million African Americans left the South for the industrial centers of the North, Midwest, and West Coast of this country during what is known as the Great Black Migration. As Black people contributed tremendously to the growth of the manufacturing industry and to the culture and politics of metropolitan life, our federal government responded through policies that sought to institutionalize racist sentiments and permanently entrench Black communities into a caste-like status, policies that were foregrounded in one of the most essential parts of economic mobility, homeownership. In 1933, as part of the Green New Deal, the Homeowners Loan Corporation developed a grading system that deemed some areas desirable while others hazardous. It did not matter that federal law ruled racial zoning unconstitutional. The creation of security maps and the redlining of Black communities encouraged the practices of real estate boards, neighborhood associations, and white mob violence that made it possible for Black people to own homes. Neighborhood grading during the 1930s was hardly a science, but programs, scientific trappings that helped turn popular racial knowledge into real world consequences, as NPV Colony, the historian, writes. Today, 74% of the areas that were deemed hazardous in 1933 remain the low-income, under-resourced, and neglected neighborhoods of today. And this is a map here of where I'm from in Miami, but I want to be clear, this was not just happening in the South. If you go on our website, you'll see a blog post that I wrote around the time of the riots after George Floyd's murder. One of the things that really defines Minneapolis, St. Paul, and actually makes it the fourth worst city in the country for Black people to live in based on metrics such as income and high school graduation rate and wealth, was the fact that Black people were barred using violence, right? Violent, like terror, as well as legalese, right? Embedded into contracts of most houses still today in Minneapolis, St. Paul, are racial covenants that prevent Black people and other races from buying and renting in homes. And that's why today Black people have been kind of segregated into two neighborhoods in Minneapolis, near North and Southern Minneapolis, which is actually Southern Minneapolis corridor, business corridor where all the Black businesses were, is where George Floyd was murdered for allegedly paying with a fake $20 bill or a bounce check. Don't know which one of those, but either way, it shows the ways in which something that happened in 1933 and that was embedded and decoded into legal language and therefore data, and it's mapped, still has implications for today. And this is an example from Chicago, right? So zip codes in the 20th century were actually organized to create, to organize the country, created to organize the country into postal, for the purposes of postal delivery. But, you know, through the creation of zip codes, what was done unintentionally, I think, was the creation of these digital numerical artifacts of the history of redlining, and has been essential to extending the shelf life of racist policies of the past. So how does that happen, right? We know that, just as I described in the Minneapolis example, or in the fact that 74% of the neighborhoods that were hazardous then are the disinvested, over-policed, and over-criminalized neighborhoods of today. When you introduce zip codes and then you bring zip codes and use it as an input in any research, right? And I'm a researcher. Usually the best data that we have, it's amazing if we can get our hands on zip codes. But this is a warning, right? This is a caution that, especially when you're creating things like car insurance algorithms, FICO credit scores, rental application algorithms, job applications, and you're using zip code, so many times it will serve as a proxy for race because of the ways in which where you live can most likely determine your race in the United States due to segregation. And this is in Chicago, where literally, if you look on the map, right, the hazardous area of 1933 are the areas where there's the most expensive car insurance premiums, right? ProPublica did this amazing study where they showed that even if, you know, for a white man who lived in downtown where there's actually higher crime because it's a commercial area and driving a sports car, which is a more quote unquote expensive, riskier car to drive, he had hundreds of dollars less in insurance premiums payments than a working class father who lived in a working class mixed neighborhood and drove a regular car, and et cetera, right? And that's a lot of the reason is because of zip code and how zip code is not only meant race, but also how it's come to denote risk, because race and perceived threat also influence risk and those perceptions. But to be clear, zip code aren't the only proxies for race, right? Beyond zip code, there are so many other examples of how big data perpetuates racism without racist. This is an example of the Compass Risk Assessment Questionnaire. Risk assessments are being used to determine how long someone is sentenced for jail, especially in a criminal legal system, actually. You have to be very intentional about language, where people often don't go to trial, right? So in this case, and you know, you read some of these questions, and it's no wonder that a white career criminal who is multiple convicted felonies has gotten, you know, according to the ProPublica study, got a lower sentence than a 15-year-old girl who got into like a neighborhood tuffle, which is like a typical teenage kid thing, right? Or was arrested for stealing a bike, right? Look at these questions, right? How many of your friends, acquaintances have ever been arrested? How often have you moved in the last 12 months? Multiple times. Were you suspended or expelled from school? Yes, I described 2 times that I got suspended already. A hungry person has a right to steal. Strongly agree or strongly disagree? How often do you feel bored? So I mean, by all standards, according to this risk assessment, I should be in prison right now, right? Who's arrested in this country? Disproportionately Black people. Who's suspended? Where I'm from in Miami, and nationally, Black students are between 5 to in some places 10 times more likely to be suspended than white students, right? So these are all proxies for race, and these are the ways in which data has taken what is most violent, what is most dangerous about racism, and been able to really amplify and exponentialize the impact of it and the harms. And for these reasons, I assert the call to action to abolish big data, to reject and dismantle the structures that concentrate the power of data into the hands of a few, and to put the power of data into the hands of those who need it the most: the refugee, the prisoner, the activist, the most vulnerable and the least powerful against the enormity of the carceral, criminal, and capitalist apparatus. Given what we know, the call to action to abolish big data, the call to action to be abolitionists in this era of big data. And again, this is a call to action I've been making for years now, as our work is grounded in the Black radical tradition. Okay, we shaped the Data for Black Lives movement after the contemporary movement to abolish prisons, as well as the primordial, the original revolutionary movement of this country, which is the movement to end chattel slavery, which in many ways is an unfinished project and a legacy that we take on. It's a torch that I accept and that we handle. It is an obligation to become an abolitionist in this era, not simply a political choice, but an ethical obligation. And it's an obligation that's ultimately grounded in critical vision. And this vision is what guides our work. We believe that we are doing what our ancestors dreamed we would do, what W.E.B. Du Bois dreamed would happen, right? When he took a team of young Black people, students and alumni of Atlanta University, and created data portraits and did sophisticated, rigorous data analysis and presented it in a world platform so that all of these myths and ideas that were being perpetuated through statistics at that time, such as the idea that Black people would eventually be extinct due to racial inferiority. No, he took that and showed not only were Black people as a population growing in the US, but that any opposition that they were facing was because of structural issues. And this is the legacy, again, that we work in, to reclaim data as protest, data as accountability, and data as collective action. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the time I have left, what we've been up to. There's so much. As I mentioned, Data for Black Lives, we've been in a moment of growth and expansion in the last year. And I'm so glad we decided to make this choice to hire new staff, beef up our programs, because I didn't predict COVID-19 to hit. But I certainly knew that what we were preparing for were the worst possible tragedies and disasters, given the state of the world and the already precarious state in which Black people in this country live. When we found out that COVID was coming to the US, and once I saw that headlines were being shared that Black people were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, we kind of sprung into action and we literally scraped every single open data portal in this whole country to get a better sense of what these disparities were looking like, right? And we've begun to track that data. This is an example of, this was the first thing that we did where we just started to track cases and death by states that had been reporting. We were pushing states to actually report and to do it accurately and to also implement consistent testing protocols. And this is the next level of visualization that we did with our research team that is going to be launched into a bigger kind of platform where folks can not only learn more about what's happening, but again, coordinate, organize, and mobilize. But most importantly, we knew that it was irresponsible for us to only talk about the data, especially as we saw narratives being formed around personal responsibility, going back to what I said about Du Bois, in racial inferiority versus a focus on these structural issues, right? So in addition to collecting the data, we did exactly what a movement would do in this moment. We said, let's bring the voices of people directly impacted who are leading on the front lines to the forefront, right? And so we organized a movement pulse check with Black epidemiologists, Black doctors, folks from the UN Committee on People of African Descent, organizers from Houston, Texas, folks from our Atlanta hub, to talk about what was happening, why it was happening, and most importantly, how can we launch and deploy a response. And it was awesome. And folks can read the report online at d4bl.org/reports. And we're going to be doing some more. We've had other pulse checks to talk about things that's happened. But really right now, it's about tracking the state's data, holding states accountable, working with state CDOs and local CDOs, but also equipping our folks on the ground to do their own data collection, because we know that there's gaps in what's being collected on a state level. Another piece of our work is in the research area that we're working on now. So a couple of years ago, a year ago, I wrote an open letter to Facebook on behalf of the Data for Black Lives movement. And in that, I laid out 3 basic demands, right? The first is to hire more Black data scientists, to work with technologists, advocates, and ethicists to establish a data code of ethics, because Facebook uses our collective data to literally publish peer-reviewed reports on research.facebook.com. And they do not have to be accountable to any kind of institutional review board or any outside third-party external review board, right? So at the very least, we need a code of ethics. But most importantly, I demanded that Facebook commit anonymized data to a public data trust. Why? Because I know, I knew about Cambridge Analytica when I was working at Color Change on election stuff. This is really just a part of how elections work at this point. Creating surveys, personality profiles, whatever data mining, data brokering that can happen to push votes and to push narratives. But I also knew that, while the likes of Christopher Wiley and Alexander Kogan had unfelt, just unlimited access to Facebook data to do whatever they wanted, Black data scientists and researchers and allies in our network would never have that kind of access, even though they're doing research on things that are demonstrably and urgently more important than anything related to kind of trying to change the US election, especially to create the conditions that we're facing now. And so that's where the idea for the data trust comes from, right? And moving beyond Facebook, what does data governance mean in this time? What does data sovereignty mean? Really borrowing and gaining inspiration from indigenous data sovereignty and data rights movements that are emerging all over the US right now and all over the world, right? How, do we not only take individual, but collective ownership of our data in a system, again, that's extractive, that's capitalist, and then it's also weaponizing said data against us, right? So this is some more information around our data trust work. There's folks who are working in the UK and people in places, again, like the UK and EU, where there's a lot more political support around data governance and data accountability. But this is our solution, right? How can we, essentially a data trust is, by definition, it's a structure where data is placed under control of a board of trustees with a fiduciary responsibility to look after the interests of the beneficiary. So you, me, and society. And using all of them offers us a greater say into how our data is collected, accessed, and used by others. So we have different examples of this, and please stay tuned, or if you want to be involved. We're exploring the use of different technical structures, anonymity, if any folks who have a lot of experience in encryption, in security, data storage, servers, please reach out to me because I do want to talk to you so we can threat model, and we can also talk more about how we can, once we make demands around data, or let's say we have folks in our network opt in and commit credit score data, genetics data, whatever, how do we make sure that's secure? Because as if you probably realize, there's lots of corporate interests who really want Black data in order to get a better sense of how to fulfill their agendas. That's all I'll say. And finally, one of the things that we're working on now around our policy work, in addition to COVID, is a No More Data Weapons campaign. And we're so inspired again and moved and excited by the mass support that people have given to existing efforts to defund the police and abolish the police. We want to make sure that algorithms will not replace police officers, right? Cities like Camden, New Jersey had already begun defunding the police after 9/11 because so many cities are actually going broke. And instead of, and while they've been happy to fire police officers, a lot have been running towards adopting new technology and even saying that, these new technologies reduce human bias, which we know is not to be true. They reinforce it. So we are working on a big project right now that I can't talk a lot about out of, again, security reasons. I'm sure you all understand. But we are looking for volunteers, folks who want to be a part of this, tracking the development of data weapons across the country, right? Data weapons are as obvious as facial recognition, which more people know about, risk assessments, predictive policing, X-rays, shot spotters, stingrays, real-time crime centers, domain awareness systems, but also things that are kind of more emerging, right? Look, I even think that Elon Musk's Neuralink is a data weapon, okay? Planting AI chips into people's brains, working with Brown University, my alma mater's BrainGate. Where are we going, right? How do we make sure that these in the wrong hands, in the hands of people with a certain political agenda, that they're not being used for harm, right? We have to make sure that, and the way that we make sure that is by dismantling, but most importantly, by putting the data into the hands of people who need it the most, training up people in order to do that. And I think that goes back to the real meat and potatoes of our work, right? The policy change is great, the federal change is great, but none of that is possible without the work of changing the cast of characters, right? 90% of the data in this world was created in the last 2 years. In a lot of ways, we don't need any more data, but we need data that is ethical, just, and useful, right? How do we go about that? We need to change who is doing data collection, who's doing analysis, and who's disseminating it, who is in power, what agendas, what ideas are determining how data is collected, who's at the forefront. And that's why we've been in this very intense process of launching hubs programs all over the world. So far, we have 5 cities, including Atlanta, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, DMV, and Minneapolis, St. Paul. And we have 50 cities in a waiting list. And the whole purpose right now is to really, again, deploy real-time, rapid response, but also ongoing and impactful data capacity to the ground in order to not only fight these harms, but again, to create a new blueprint for the future and to make data a tool instead of a weapon. Also, this was a save the date for our conference. We are actually postponing this conference to July 2021, but please stay in touch for more information about some ongoing activities and events we have coming up. And finally, I'd like to leave you all with a last thought. You know, what are we optimizing? That was a question that I asked earlier as we talked about data science. But what are we optimizing? A future where injustices of the past are automated and reinforced? A past defined by slavery, dehumanization, greed, and violence and control? Or a future vested in justice, fairness, solidarity, a world where the needs of all people are met? Dylan Rodriguez defines abolition as a dream towards futurity, vested in insurgent, counter-civilizational histories, genealogies of collective genius that perform liberation under conditions of duress. Abolition is a process, not an end goal. It is the rejection of prisons or police or criminalization or control as the answers to our most pressing social problems. And the process of abolition begins in our minds, in our organizations, our academic institutions. It is a new way of understanding the world. I believe that abolition is against certainty. Abolition is against permanence. The permanence of the prison cell, the guard tower, the weapon in its factory. Abolition is about asserting life in a system that demands death, casualties, human bodies as its tribute. Abolition is for us right now, while simultaneously being for generations to come. People we may never meet, see, but we must will into existence, just as our ancestors willed us. And I'm confident that a new world is possible. A world that we can begin building right now, right here, right at this very moment. And I invite all of you to join us in this effort. I hope you can be a part of what we are building. Thank you so much, Hope Conference. Have a good day.